Hi, this is Paul. Yesterday I made this video on Jordan Peterson and John Rich, and that was an interesting conversation. I listened to a lot of the Daily Wire exclusive conversation. I really enjoyed how Peterson handled himself in this conversation, where, of course, Rich has his position and he tried to promote his position. I just saw another video where, Jordan Peterson gets humbled because John Rich had this clear exposition, something of that nature. Now, almost right out after I finished working on that video yesterday, this video dropped with Zena Shrek. And I just heard the little intro. This is Anton LaVey's daughter. And now I'm basically the same age as Zena Shrek and Jordan Peterson are. And so I'm a little bit young to remember a lot of this stuff, but I certainly knew who Anton LaVey was, and I certainly had a sense of what this whole Satanism thing was. And I also lived through the satanic panic thing that went on in the 80s. And so it was like, yes, I'm going to watch this one. But I was busy all for the rest of the day, and I basically got a chance to listen to this one early this morning, and I listened to it start to finish, and it was gripping all the way through. And I thought Jordan was again, he was back sort of in clinician mode. And he listened to her very well. He asked good questions. She was not necessarily an easy guest, and not in that she was hostile or anything like that. It wasn't always easy to track with her and sort of keep on track with how things were going. Now, the Daily Wire exclusive, I just finished listening to that. That was so to get to the end of the video, she basically says, well, I found Buddhism, and Buddhism helped me clean up my life. And I thought, I kind of want to talk to Mark Palmer or Mark Parker about, maybe I should call him by the wrong name too, Jacob, Mark Parker about this, because of course Mark Parker has Buddhism plays a very interesting part in Mark Parker's story. Do I have his name right? Boy, I better check. Yeah, I got his name right. And, there have been some really interesting videos out lately. And what Mark D. Parker has been doing, he sort of reacted to my reaction to Jonathan Peugeot. We had this really interesting conversation with Neil and Ron, alias Sir Dude, for this video, which kept driving poor Mark crazy. And then Mark then went on to have an interesting conversation with Jacob, too, about this subject. And these were all candidates for more attention, but I just have very limited opportunity to make videos this week. So maybe I'll make some clips of some of this stuff, because there's really some good stuff in all of these. But this conversation was just wild. And it was wild because her story is so painful. So basically, to sum a bunch of this up, her mother marries Anton LaVey. And Anton LaVey, the father of, let's say, modern Satanism, basically, modern Satanism was sort of a counter to the counterculture. But it wasn't sort of a square counter to the counterculture, let's say, like Richard Nixon. This guy decides that he's going to basically invert a whole bunch of the things in the Bible, like, don't turn the other cheek, smash the other cheek, and he decides he's going to sort of kind of live by this. And he's a terrible father. He's a terrible husband. He starts this quasi-religion, which is really more of a scam. So the guy has a background in carnivals and scams, and he sees anybody who really signs up for Satanism as dupes. But there's high profile celebrities who get special access to him, and he really likes the limelight. And she didn't go into it, but I cannot but imagine that this little girl growing up in that household suffered all sorts of trauma and pain and suffering. And it's just a terrifying story. And what's so interesting, coming on the heels of this story, so of course this was the thumbnail that I made because I couldn't remember Midnight Mass, and this revelation video that he made that it looks like it comes out of something from Frank Peretti's book from the 80s. And so John Rich has this evangelical narrative, and some of you sort of push back on the Gnosticism part. Again, he's not a theologian. He picks this stuff up in churches, and he picks this stuff up from culture. But it's really interesting how in the John Rich video, evil is veiled. And if you see behind the veil, it's this guy in this weird angel costume that's been given some Renaissance fair sword. And he's going to make kind of a... Remember what videos were like when MTV started? That's kind of like this. And what's sort of amazing about this is... Now, I guess this is a historic church, and I didn't look it up, but it's sort of a archetypal country church. Now, what's really amazing about these little buildings is that most modern churches really struggle to use them if they try at all, because all these churches is sort of a meeting house for usually something of a frontier community that can just put enough wood together to have a meeting where they can all stay out of the rain. And modern churches have things like classrooms and offices and air conditioning units and so on and so forth, because there's all of these things going on. But this sort of occupies the sort of iconic imagination of Americans. And so then it kind of inhabits this vision that he has of what evil behind the scenes looks like. And when you get to this video, you really get a sense of evil. Now, another really interesting video that has come out. Byrne sent me this video about the symptom pool, and I can see why this image really caught his imagination, because he found this book from Crazy Like Us, which is from the mid-aughts by Ethan Waters, where basically the globalization of the American psyche, and he goes into that a little bit, and then he gets into all of these psychological trends that have tended to spread from America out into the world. And now, of course, Jordan Peterson's talked about this quite a bit. Young women are particularly susceptible to sort of social contagions of various kinds. 20 years ago, we heard an enormous amount about anorexia and bulimia, and that was sort of going through. You have very old suicide contagions, and these go way back. If you basically look at the witch hunts, they were sort of a contagion. And again, it tends to be young women that fall prey to this. And so these social contagions go through, and part of Byrne's point is that America exports these things. And then he got into some of this stuff about a symptom pool, where, well, maybe I can find a good place to jump into this.
Guilty of this on some level. Because Americans tend to, even though our country is huge, we bring in people from every country imaginable into the country to live, be a part of it. We tend to imagine, though, that the rest of the world is just like us. So that if we define something a certain way, it must be universally true.
Now this is deeply part of the Enlightenment, because again, part of what was happening in 500 years ago in Europe during the Protestant Reformation, where you have the Columbian Exchange, you have the discovery of the Americas, you have you have the printing press, you have all of these things that as we are experiencing today, sort of the foundations of sense making are being shaken and disrupted. Part of what the Enlightenment wanted to do was get to the bottom of sense making by sort of a materialist, foundationalist approach to knowing. And that's where I was talking about emissarianism and sort of this idea that if we can just strip the world of all opinions and get down to facts, we can sort of use these facts as foundations and build the world up from there. And this is part of the reason, and of course, the West has been enormously successful in this for a whole variety of reasons in a number of different ways. And that sort of creates a universalist assumption beneath all of our things. So anorexia, well, that's a disease. Here we have this symptom, and that's a disease, and this is how to treat it. And here we have this other, and you see this with, of course, Byrne is gonna talk about the whole transgender, transitioning children and this whole thing, because this seems to be yet another wave. And as has been the case with many of these waves, well, there was always sort of anorexia and bulimia, but suddenly there's an epidemic of it. And there's always sort of gender dysphoria of one level or another. But now there's an epidemic of it. And so these little things suddenly become huge things, and the whole culture sort of convulses around them. And of course, Americans, because we think that we have sort of unearthed the foundations of the earth with these facts, and we have built our system upon them, that this must be going on in every country. Whereas in many ways, many of these social epidemics that are going through our culture are just going through our culture, and they're not going through everywhere.
But the point of this book is to say, no, it's not, but it's becoming that way. And what he means is this. The first four major sections of the book deals with anorexia. Now, one of the things he talks about, let me go back to this concept of the symptom pool. Edward Shorter came up with this idea through psychology of what's called the symptom pool. The symptom pool, there is a guy who has a channel called Psych Hacks. I think I'll run a little clip of his description of this in a moment. And you should go over and check out his, just type in YouTube the word symptom pool. His will be the first and probably only thing apart from this that will deal with this. Because as soon as you understand what this is about, you suddenly realize, uh-oh. Yeah. This isn't going to get national coverage anytime soon. The symptom pool is essentially that there are ways of manifesting our problems. We come up against the limits of our ability to speak them. If you could say, for instance, I am horrendously, feeling this, could precisely describe your emotional condition, people would look at you and say, well, Byrne, it sounds like you've got a handle on it. So that's not a problem. It's not that big a problem.
You have to understand that a person who is suffering internally in a non-visible way has a problem. This person needs to find ways to communicate that suffering to other people in a way that they can understand, that is likely going to produce the level of care and concern appropriate to that degree of suffering. Now you might think, well, what's wrong with using your words, Orion? Well, think about it. If I were to come up to you and say, I'm in a lot of pain and I feel very confused. My thoughts are so chaotic, I can barely make sense of them. And it's so intense that I don't think how much longer I can take it. You actually might not take me too seriously. That's because my statement is kind of paradoxical. If I really were in that much pain, and if my thoughts really were that chaotic, could I really talk about my situation in such a rational, cogent, and sensible way? The how of my message would undermine the what of my message. On the other hand, if I were to say, stop practicing basic hygiene, start spending all day in bed, and begin crying with no apparent provocation, would you really believe me if I told you with my words, I feel perfectly fine, never been better? Probably not. And that's because when the how and the what of a message are incongruent, almost everyone gives precedence to the how. So direct communication is useful to securing care and concern for certain degrees of suffering, but it doesn't work for more elevated degrees of suffering. The communication must be deviant enough to signal the presence of a significant problem, but often not so deviant as to cause others to have the sufferer locked up in a padded cell for his or her own good.
What's happened over time is that we then find other ways of manifesting. Now that word's been spoiled by these manifestors, which is pretty much a good case in point for social contagion. We've been spoiled by the manifestation. Let me start that again. We will, when we are in really deep distress, will unconsciously manifest our problems in a way to get people to really look at us. One of those problems would be anorexia, which we'll talk about in just a moment. But another one would have been something like hysteria back in the 19th century. Now, today's basic mode of discussing hysteria is that it wasn't a real disease. Many feminists will say, the male doctors diagnosed this, and there are all these different issues related to it. And this was their imposition of these ideas because they were afraid of women. Really? Is that how you feel about anorexia? Because it's the same kind of thing. Yes, indeed, there was hysteria in this clinically strange sense. Just as, yes, indeed, there is anorexia. But if you were to tell somebody that, anorexia just exists here, it then makes the symptoms. See, what we've done is we've made any symptom that we have explicable by treatment, which is a very interesting clue to our problem. Anyway, to go back to the idea of the symptom pool. The symptom pool says it's kind of like a medical variant on the Overton window. It's the kinds of things that are considered a problem at any given age. So we no longer have hysteria in the symptom pool. But then again, they didn't have PTSD in the symptom pool. They didn't have bulimia in the symptom pool. They didn't have our anorexia in the symptom pool, and other things like this.
The symptom pool is a collection of constantly evolving, culturally bound communication strategies for expressing different levels of suffering. Everyone influences the symptom pool, but no one controls it. What's more, few people consciously choose to manifest these symptoms. That is, very few people intentionally use these strategies instrumentally. We call these people malingerers. Rather, most people implement these strategies unconsciously, which is what is so fascinating. Sufferers are generally conscious of their symptoms, but they're not conscious of why these particular symptoms manifested as opposed to some other symptoms. The symptom pool is generally cultivated unintentionally and unconsciously at the population level, and the symptoms generally manifest unintentionally and unconsciously at the individual level. Now, these communication strategies are always connected to certain times and places, which is why we can kind of consider almost every form of mental illness to be a culturally bound syndrome. And this is also why we see, for lack of a better word, fads with respect to mental illness. Like, some ways of communicating distress come into favor in certain times and places, spread wildly, and then completely disappear. For example, there have been almost no cases of glove paralysis or neurasthenia or hysterical pregnancy for quite some time, despite the fact that all three of these conditions were extremely common in the 19th century. And this is very strange, of course, because if there were a clear biological or genetic correlate for these sorts of things, well, it's doubtful that those correlates would have been so completely weeded out of the gene pool over the last 100 years.
What happens is that in the symptom pool are the things where a person can, in a sense, dip into it for their mental illnesses.
And of course, they don't do it consciously. So before the Chino event, John Vervaeke mentioned that he was reading this book about homesickness. And you don't have to read very far in this book to realize, holy cow! I mean, people were dying of homesickness. This was something that was diagnosed by medical professionals, and it was a life-threatening illness. And today, someone is homesick. Well, they're just missing home. Well, not as described here. And so, basically a whole number of things were just listed off in that video, that these things are actually all over us. And part of what's interesting about human beings, again, of course, psychologists are deeply aware of this because this is what they do. There's always sort of the conscious level where we're sort of working in this conscious space. And of course, the furniture of the conscious level is provided by the formation that we have received. When I was thinking about the Olympic trials, not the Olympic trials, the opening ceremony, and the closing ceremony was weird too. But the opening ceremony, and you think, well, what? Okay, so they're messing around with all of these images. They're messing around with Da Vinci's Lord's Supper. But okay, so when Da Vinci made the Lord's Supper and put it in that little church in Milan, he was messing with things too. And part of what happens in sort of an image-based culture is that every generation of artists comes along and starts messing with the different things that are on the table, and civilization is sort of the ongoing conversation of all of these messing with images. But of course, if you start, and Peugeot's been very good on this, if you start doing things like inverting images, you might say, well, these are people that they're playing around with these things. But we don't really know how it impacts, at least I don't know, I'm sure others know far better than I do, how this impacts people, because the furniture of the things around us and the expressions and the representations of the things around us sort of create for us a world, and we use these things to sort of calibrate the world and to try in one way or another to sort of maintain stability. And Peterson talked about this, it was a number of months ago, then he was talking more about sanity. And I think he was exactly right, because sanity is not just sort of the proper function between your ears in the same way that your heart function is something that the doctors can sort of measure. Oh, your heart is moving this amount. Our engagement, our transjective engagement with the world is so much more mysterious. And these elements of stories, and Peterson, of course, would talk about archetypes, and these elements of stories within the culture deeply impact us in terms of our stability and calibration of how to operate in the world. And that's why you have things in a language such as, dirty words. And, I was talking to Job, there's a past thing about this in terms of, language learners often don't have the sort of internal sense of, oh, you shouldn't say that word. I won't use Job as an example. I'll use another Dutchman as an example. There's a fellow missionary of mine. I had two fellow missionaries. One grew up in Chino, California, son of a dairyman who was a Dutch immigrant. And the other guy was actually from the Netherlands and came to the Dominican Republic through Canada as an adult. And so his whole life, most of his life he had been speaking Dutch. And my friend who had grown up on a dairy, who had picked up all of this Dutch just sort of from laborers on the dairy, would say some words, and the other guy would look at him like, you shouldn't say those words. And he didn't know because, of course, we develop the furnishings and the assumptions, and our whole emotional world's based on all of this stuff. And so this symptom pool is a fascinating idea because the other guy, the psych hacks guy, talks about the fact that, we experience this suffering, and the suffering gets expressed somehow, and people don't pick people don't pick these things out of thin air. They pick these things off the cultural menu. And when you get whole groups of people sort of expressing the same thing, they might be expressing very different reasons for suffering, which make these kinds of things very difficult to diagnose, especially sort of in a modern scientific paradigm where well, it must be a chemical imbalance or something. So let's give you some medicine to sort of fix the brain. And for some people, that might help. But again, every time I watch psychiatrists try to treat people I know, they're playing around with a lot of pharmaceuticals. So often seems like so much trial and error. Let's give this to you and let's have you on this for 6 months and then let's see how you feel. And of course the whole sense of it is this: do you feel better or you feel worse? Well, is that the strategy? I mean, I feel better if I sit around and eat crappy. Well, what do you mean you feel better if you sit around and eat crappy? Well, I felt fine when I sat around and eat crappy when I was in my 30s. Now that I'm in my 60s, if I sit around and eat crappy, my body's not quite so forgiving. So that doesn't say anything about, in fact, what's going on. And I might feel bad because someone I love died, or I might feel bad because I'm having a fight with someone that I care about, or I might feel bad because nobody's watching my videos anymore, or I might feel bad because, whatever reason. And so we're so much more complex. And what was so interesting is that when, okay, this is what evil looks behind the veil. It looks like a guy who sort of looks like Grim Grizz in a white costume with some fancy wings and a Renaissance fair sword. When what was so fascinating is, what evil looked like. It was so banal. Her father's something of a Machiavellian psychopath who is absolutely not a good father and basically ignores his daughter. And her mother had also a terrible growing up, and she describes the household that her mother grew up in and how that affected the way that her mother could raised her. And then, I mean, just listening to this story, it was just like, oh man. And while her story is so bizarre, partly because it's so public, and that, I mean, this guy is sort of trolling 1960s style the world with this Satanism business, and you just get the sense that you just attracted a lot of creepy guys and a lot of sick people. And then, of course, the pushback from the world isn't going to be kind when, then all these Christians are then, basically threatening them with violence. One of the interesting things that I thought about, one of the interesting comparisons, was Megan Phelps Roper, who, of course, I first sort of learned about her through the J.K. Rowling's podcast. And it was so interesting because she sort of tells her story. And so you kind of have Westboro Baptist, which is sort of the height of hardlineism Christianity. Take no prisoners. We are going to go all out in our culture war against these people. And when you listen to her and her story about, even the Westboro Baptist people, I mean, there's some not good stuff going on there. But at the same time, you also get the sense that she was loved and she was cared for. And they might have some really unhealthy, twisted approaches to Christianity, and let's say thinking about how to love your enemies in the midst of a culture war. But you compare her story to that of Zena Shrek, and what really emerges is sort of the brutal banality of evil. And it doesn't look like some dude in a bad 1980s music video, or even this, I really, that Midnight Mass show was just, they come out, it was interesting because miracles were happening, and sort of the first episode you're watching, it's like, where's this going? Where's this going? And then this vampire shows up and it's like, oh, really? You know, you just kind of, cheated the whole thing. And then the thing just, didn't was sort of downhill from there. But what you could see here was sort of this banality of evil and the need for orientation. Now, another video that was out recently, Luke, it was almost a 4-hour live stream that happened, and Rod Hare we've done a bunch of these marriage crisis videos with Rod Hare. And somebody asked, when are you going to do another marriage crisis video? He's like, well, we'd love to. We just have to get Paul and Eamon and Catherine and Rod all together again and get time on our calendar, and we'll do it again. But the truth is, we talked about a bunch of things, and Rod, I think Rod's been telling me about his ideas and his thesis for a very long time now. I thought he really was able to explain it well in this video. And one of the things that he's saying is that part of why men and women seem to be going in different directions culturally and not being able to sort of come together and make things work is that the at least the first draft mappings that at least a unified culture was able to offer have been undermined. And you see that in the Satanist thing, where this poor little girl's world is just twisted upside down. And I think so often people like to imagine that, especially nihilists like to imagine that things are arbitrary and everything's sort of a human convention and a social construction. But part of what was so interesting about her conversation with Peterson was that the more she talked, the more evident it was that there is a structure to reality. And at least with Megan Phelps Roper, while there was some deep twistedness going on in Westboro Baptist, boy, that dude did a number on his daughter. And so this conversation, I think I'm going to take a clip of it and maybe do a little forward to it or something, because I thought, especially, where McMo and Rod, how they were sort of interacting and then others sort of joining in. I thought it was just a tremendous conversation.
It's definitely the glue that binds you together and motivates.
To not only deal.
So McMo was telling a story a little bit about how he gets, and you can watch some of the smaller channels. You can watch McMo's talk with Chad, for example, about how he gets fired from this mega church and how he grew up in a fairly strict traditional Christian setting that said, here are the man's roles and here are the woman's roles. And part of what McMo and his wife's journey has been sort of tinkering with these things and finding, well, she's better gifted at these things, and so she's sort of majoring in that, and he's better gifted at these things and they're majoring in that, and it didn't really fit sort of the strict Christian template. And Rod sort of, continues on with this, and Rod's by no means sort of this iron-bound traditionalist. Rod's a pretty pragmatic guy who actually knows a ton about psychology.
With people not meeting your expectations, but deal with you not meeting theirs.
Well, it's definitely the glue that binds you together and motivates you to keep trying. But I guess what I'm saying is I think it's insufficient. Is essentially what I'm getting at. I think it's a necessary but insufficient condition. You must love each other, yes, but you also must have relatively mature approaches to how to relate to another human being in a way that's mutually satisfying. And where do you learn to do that if it's not through a formation process? Partly McMo, growing up where you did versus where I did, I grew up in Southern California in the 70s. Like, I went to elementary school with kids who were growing up in communes. Like, I would visit, friends who were living in a commune, and, a lot of the hippie culture and the hot tub culture literally sprouted in where I grew up. So I knew these people, right? And so I saw kind of like what Bern Power talks about, right? Like, he's a little older, but he was there as a young adult and seeing the Haight-Ashbury district in San Francisco and the things that were happening. And so I'm much more familiar with people who've grown up with no religious traditions whatsoever. They would be completely lost in any of the kind of conversations that we're having. At least I grew up reading the Bible, so I'm literate. I know the references, I know the stories, and I can keep up. But if you don't have any
No
of those
need to
traditions,
brag.
I'm just trying to have a little bit of credibility with you Christian folks. So some of what you're hearing from me is way out there on the left coast, watching people literally try to make it up as they go along and see how lost so many people get. And so it's informed by that. And even as you tell your story, you are definitely nested in a tradition that at least gave you something to reject, right? There was something to at least start with. And there are so many people where they don't have any of that. Basically, they have what, the equivalent of what TikTok would tell them today they deserve from a man or from a woman.
Yeah, it's rough. It's rough. This is something I've thought about, not just like in other places in life too, which is it's kind of like the idea is like, do you need to know the law? Like, do you need to know the Ten Commandments before you can accept Jesus into your heart, kind of a thing, and obviously this is totally out of left field, but it seems like a similar thing where it's like,
All right, McBo, you're totally out of left field, so you're not fitting the constraints of this. But there's so many ways for this to just sort of go bad, and I thought, again, I found this to be just this is one of my favorite Peterson interviews, and I don't really have a little spot in it that I can point to and say, oh, it's right here, and I got this idea right here, and I got this nugget or this insight right here. But just how, my goodness, it's amazing this poor woman can live at all after what her father and what her father, how she was raised. But ironically, again, there's almost no story that I hear from someone that doesn't have at least some degree, and some of which has just horrendous degrees of suffering, and the end of which you just are amazed that one way or another this person somehow managed not to be a monster at the other end of it. And this this poor woman, she was a dutiful daughter, and she at one point, there's this serial killer that's getting involved in their household. I mean, it's just the most insane story. It's just the most insane story, but at the same time, it's also just so real. And so then to say, okay, you've got this, and even her Daily Wire exclusive, I was listening to her framing of Buddhism, and it sort of made Scientology and certain Christian framings of the world sound almost materialistic. It was just very interesting. And Jordan, I was super impressed. Jordan sat there and listened and listened and listened and listened, and finally, it's time to land the plane. And at one point, Jordan really tried to redirect her and try to give her something concrete that listeners could hear and sort of take away. Give us in some concrete ways how your life has improved. And again, it was just more Buddhist evangelization sermon that she was giving. So you could, in my opinion, you could totally skip the Daily Wire exclusive section of this video, even though this part of this video, the YouTube part of the video, was absolutely captivating. So yeah, I'm super curious. I just threw a whole bunch of things up there at you. I'm super curious what people in the corner have to say about this, because again, there's this wave going through the church right now, which is not full-blown Westboro Baptist. But you almost get the sense, listening to some people, that they would rather be part of Westboro Baptist than maybe a nice little dying church down the street that loves one another. Jake Meter, who writes at Mere Orthodoxy, wrote a piece for Dispatch, After Virtue Came Strongman Politics. And I thought he really sort of nicely walked through at least one aspect. In a lot of ways, Rod Dreer's the hero of this story. He sort of walked through, sort of where this has gone. And here's a great summary paragraph that I clipped. The irony in all of this is that just as the post-liberal right has become maximally partisan in its outlook and sensibilities, it has been abandoned by the very party and leader it looked for security. Last month's Republican National Convention included the GOP abandoning its commitment to the cause of life, leaving behind what little remained of its support for natural marriage, and platforming Amber Rose, a social media star who routinely posts pornographic images of her social media handles, and only a few months ago praised Satanist groups for helping women secure abortions. 5 years after Amari sold many on the notion that the authoritarian leadership of Trump was necessary to advance the good life, the party of Trump now resembles a more sexually progressive version of the 1990s era Democratic Party. What can be learned from this history? There was for many of us in the mid-2010s a profound sense that something was missing in our common life in America. Material abundance seemed, as Alexander Solzhenitsyn warned, inextricably bound with spiritual poverty. The false human story told by many progressives and conservatives alike in the years since Reagan, a story built around individual identity creation and the limitless pursuit of wealth through free, but to what end, markets, often at the cost of transcendent truth that left many people and places adrift. The whole piece was a good one, and I'll leave a link below. And let's see, how can I do this? Well, that's because that's still full screen. So I'll do this, and then I'll do this, and then I'll do this. No, come on, go. Yeah, watching me reshape windows is pretty boring stuff. Anyway, it's pretty messy, but I just thought I'd be really curious. Oh, where am I? I lost myself here. Here we are. I'd be really curious to hear from you if you've watched some of these things, if you just sort of put these things side by side, what do you notice? Because you can sort of take the Westboro Baptist and Anton LaVey's Satanism, Megan Phelps Roper, and then John Rich's video behind the veil attempt. But then this, it was just like, wow. Evil. G.K. Chesterton writes about this as perceptively as anyone, that evil is just so banal. And in the end, boring, but soul crushing. And the good, it's one thing to, it's always easier to write an evil character, and so often the evil characters are so interesting. Peter Kraft says, one of C.S. Lewis's greatest literary achievements is Aslan, because he was actually able to make a good character exciting and powerful, whereas describing evil and pointing out evil, easy. The good, there's a lot more to that. Anyway, so curious to hear what you're going to have to say about this. So again, don't know. I had a little time this afternoon, so could make this video. We'll see as the week progresses. Maybe I'll clip up some of this stuff that's been in the corner, because the people have been making some good stuff, and I by no means have enough chance to watch everything. I mean, Christian Baxter continues to do great interviews, and people are saying, "Oh, you got to watch this one, got to watch that one." Still, I really want to do Alex O'Connor and Peugeot. that conversation because it's interesting. Anyway, leave a comment. Let me know what you think.